You know, as we look around at all of these amazing artifacts, I'm struck by not only just the artistic ability that they had, but the engineering. I'm struck by the fact that the same human mind that we build lots of things today was at play here. They were building tools, they were creating artifacts that were artistic. I'm amazed by the design that we see in all of these. Does that strike you when you're out on your digs?
There are forms of the artifacts that have been found, that have been dug up, that demonstrate the glory and the power of man, such as the Khorsabad bull that we looked at before, of its enormous size in relation to the desire that the king had to demonstrate his power to the people and their need to submit to him, their need to ascribe glory to him. And yet at the same time, we have fine work being done on cuneiform tablets and on scarabs with hieroglyphics. So all of these things show us the intricacy that's involved. And certainly the technological advances that we see are fascinating as well.
Right. There is an issue that has been raised throughout all of my time with these scientists that comes back often to the issue of time. In the area of archaeology, how do you establish the chronology and those dates? What do you use to do that?
That's an important question, because ultimately the ancients didn't have the same absolute calendar that we have today. And it's very difficult, very challenging to understand exactly when things transpired and along the timeline that goes back into ancient history. So there are several methods that we have to rely on. One, for example, with the Neo-Assyrian Empire, is that they had what was called an eponymic dating method, where they dated every year according to the main event that transpired during that year. And so every year was named after that year, such as 2001 in the United States, of course, would be the Twin Towers coming down in New York City. And because of the fact that they record a number of important events that we can trace and we can identify and plot on the absolute time scale, we're able to correlate their records with the timing of absolute dating. So that's one thing that's very helpful, but ultimately that mainly helps us with the first millennium BC. It doesn't help us much with the second and third millennium BC. Now, a second method for obtaining dates and coming to a good understanding of chronology with ancient history is related to organic material, such as plant life or animal life. If we can find something that lived, something that had an organic element to it, we're able to, through radiocarbon dating, establish a range, not a specific date, but a range of time, and we can be fairly well confident about the dating based on the radiocarbon decay that goes all the way back to about 1400 BC. Now, once we get to 1400 BC, we have a problem. And this is noticed throughout the world of ancient Near Eastern historical studies. And that problem is that we have an offset. And what happens with this offset is, let's say, for example, that historically we know something should be dated to 1480 or 1500 BC. And it's abundantly clear in the historical record that you can't really fudge on that number very much. Well, then the radiocarbon evidence is going to suggest that it dates to around 1600 instead. And so we have this offset. There is a contradiction in the evidence. The historical evidence says one thing and the radiocarbon evidence says another. And the variation there can be 100 to 120 years within that time period just before 1400 BC. And it's very important to note that this offset increases in its gap between the historical and radiocarbon dating as you go back in time. In other words, if you go back another couple hundred years, the offset is more than 100 or 120 years. It becomes 200 to 250 years. So it essentially is an exponential problem that exists in the radiocarbon evidence. And this essentially is causing a great division within scholarship of the ancient Near East. But now evidence has shown that this isn't just a local phenomenon, because before it was known and understood as having taken place in northern Egypt in ancient times. Now we see it throughout the ancient Near East, including the Levant and beyond. And other sites are giving us evidence demonstrating this offset. This presents a great challenge. I'm not sure that we can be 100% sure how to account for this. I think we can perhaps solve this problem in the historical dating based on a better understanding of Scripture. So, for example, if there was some kind of major upheaval in the relationship between the sun and the earth at the time of the universal flood on the planet Earth, it's very possible that we could have something that transpired such as a change in the rate of decay of the radiocarbon in all organic life form. And that would make up for this, this offset that we see. And certainly the biblical text would match with that, because we see lifespans before the flood and for a short time after the flood being a lot larger, a lot longer than the time period after that. So it's very possible that all of this correlates together. So what we would see as being much older actually was much more recent than that.
Dr. Snelling was talking about the evidence that they were beginning to see that pointed back to a period when that radioactive decay actually had accelerated. So that's along the same line that you're talking about there.
Absolutely, and that may provide the kinds of answers that would solve the problems that now face not only Christians who study archaeology and ancient history, but all scholars.
There's also a difference of opinion in terms of the dates associated with the Masoretic text and the Septuagint. Can you explain that a little bit?
First, we go back to Genesis 11. And within Genesis 11, we have one of the genealogies. Basically gives us the history of the transmission of people going from the time of the flood down to Abraham. And in that genealogy, we have various readings in the text. We have different Hebrew traditions, different written traditions of the Bible, even beyond the Hebrew Bible, that give us information that would cause us to understand maybe one or another is problematic. The textual variation we have in Genesis 11 is a very complex problem. And when you study the issue, you see that there's basically two textual traditions there. The Masoretic tradition and what we call a double textual tradition of the Samaritan Pentateuch, which is an older form of the Hebrew Bible, and the LXX or Septuagint, which is the Greek translation of the Hebrew Bible. So these two textual traditions match up together in contrast to what we read in the Genesis 11 account in the Masoretic text. So with the Masoretic text, basically you have the period of the flood going back only a certain time period in the 3rd millennium BC, such that it's very difficult to find time for all of the archaeological periods that take place. You can't fit Nimrod in as the Akkadian leader. You can't fit the Tower of Babel in. And that's very problematic. But there are two other textual traditions apart from the Masoretic text. And those are independent traditions, and they're found in the Samaritan Pentateuch and the Septuagint, known as the LXX, the Greek translation of the Hebrew Bible. And in those texts, the numbers are different. And if you take those numbers as being factual, that allows the flood to be pushed back to about 3108 BC, and it gives you a lot of ability to fit in the archaeological periods. And ultimately, we can explain the rise of the wrong reading better with the reading of the Septuagint and the Samaritan Pentateuch. Now, basically what it comes down to is this. With a number of the men who are the fathers, the ones who sire children who are part of this genealogy, there's a difference in how old that man was at the time that he birthed that child who was part of that genealogy. So, for example, if a father in the Masoretic text was 30 years old when he sired that child, in the Septuagint and the Samaritan Pentateuch, it says that he was 130 years old. So you have this same type of repeated problem in the textual tradition. Now, what's interesting is that when you come to the end of that lifespan of that certain patriarch, he lives the exact same amount of time in the Masoretic text versus the double tradition of the Samaritan Pentateuch and the Septuagint. So the question is, which tradition is correct and which is incorrect? Now, I wrote my Master of Theology thesis in the area of lower textual criticism, which essentially is the study of what did the text of the Bible in the original manuscripts say, whether in Hebrew, Aramaic, or Greek. We have a number of principles that we use in the field of textual criticism. These are called canons. And the most important, and this is universally recognized as the most important canon for determining correct readings, is this: choose the reading that best accounts for the other readings. Now, what that comes down to is the correct reading is going to account for how you develop the spurious reading. So if you were a Masoretic scribe and you saw that the man was 30 years old when he sired his child, is there any reason that would make you change your text in hopes that you're improving it to alter the number to 130 years of age when he sired that child?
I can't think of any.
Right. So we can account for the reading in the Masoretic text by changing it from 130 to 30. That's very logical. It's absolutely illogical to change the text from 30 years of age to 130 years of age. And in this textual tradition, we have two independent lines of textual tradition that both bear with them the same numbering. So most likely, although the Masoretic text on the whole more often is correct than the other textual lines or textual sources with the Hebrew Bible, in this case, almost certainly the Masoretic text itself is wrong.
Yeah. But what is interesting to me in all of this, in the same way I was very interested in Edwin Thiele's work, when he spent most of his life, I guess, trying to understand the differences associated with the dates, in Kings and Chronicles and so forth, and he did, and solved all of that problem. What I'm struck with is that there is a reason why we care about these texts, and the reason is because we see them as being sourced by God Himself.
Absolutely.
If we really believed they were just sourced by people, then we wouldn't really care that much. Is that part of the reason why we're so hungry to find the answer to these questions?
It is part of the reason. And for us, we see the biblical text as different than any other form of literature in the entire history of the world. Why? Because for us, the biblical text has what we call dual authorship. It has a human author and a divine author who are working together harmoniously. How that took place, it's difficult for us to comprehend. But we do understand from the texts that talk about the inspiration of the human authors, we can see that the Spirit of God is working together with the Spirit of the biblical writer to not only preserve accurately everything that was written, but to preserve the will of God and the mind of God and the heart and character of God in that text.
Sure, yeah. And that, of course, is the mystery that we even find within Christ. He was fully God and fully man, and yet we know that that is true. We can't understand everything about that.
Yeah, but it doesn't seem logical. It's like the Trinity.
That's correct.
It doesn't seem logical that you could have one God yet be manifested in three persons.
Yet it is not contradictory
No.
in itself. It's just mysterious.
Right, and it's beyond what the human mind can comprehend.
Yes, yeah. Doug, after all of your years in archaeology, and all that you've seen and the digs and all of your scientific work, are you more convinced in the historicity of Genesis, or are you less convinced?
I'm absolutely more convinced. And I've essentially dedicated my life to the study not only of the scripture itself and trying to understand what was originally written by the inspired authors, but to defend that against attacks that are currently being made in the area of historicity. And then you might say, why is that so important? The reason is this: because if someone can undermine your understanding of the historical facts that are, or at least purported to be factual in the biblical text, if someone can prove to you that that has erred in some way, probably it's going to undermine your belief in the spiritual message in the Bible, and in the characters of the Bible, and in the events of the Bible that are recorded, and the encounters between people, and the miracles. All of these things are going to be eroded away if you undermine the historicity of the biblical text.
But we don't assume that it is correct just simply in order to hold that up. What you're saying is that the evidence you have found and the evidence that we see here in this museum, it all corroborates that.
It does. It corroborates all of the events in many ways in the biblical text.